The book is The Liberty Amendments, Restoring the American Republic. This will be the book that the ruling class will hate the most. And that's good, because it's aimed exactly at them. Now, let me just continue on here and wrap this up. Unlike the statists who defy, ignore, and rewrite the Constitution for purpose of evasion, as they push their big government, coercive rules and techniques and so forth, I propose that we, the people, take a closer look at the Constitution itself for our preservation. The Constitution provides, the Constitution provides the means for restoring self-government and averting societal catastrophe, or in the case of societal collapse, resurrecting the civil society in Article 5. Article 5 sets forth the two processes for amending the Constitution, the second of which we're going to focus on. Article 5 says in part that Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or, this is what I want to emphasize, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. Now, stick with me. Importantly, I want to emphasize this. In neither case of amending the Constitution does Article 5, that process, provide for a constitutional convention. This is important, because you're going to hear critics say, we don't need a constitutional convention. We'll never get anybody better than the framers. And they're right. This isn't a constitutional convention. This is a convention for proposing amendments to the Constitution. In other words, Congress can propose amendments to the Constitution, and has in 27 cases, which have been ratified. And the states can too, through the convention process. The first method, where 2/3 of Congress passes a proposed amendment and then forwards it to the state legislatures for possible ratification by 3/4 of the vote, that has occurred 27 times. The second method, involving the direct application of 2/3 of the state legislatures for a convention for proposing amendments, not a constitutional convention, a convention for proposing amendments to the Constitution, which would thereafter require 3/4 of the states to ratify, has been tried in the past without success, and today it sits dormant. The fact is that Article 5 expressly grants state legislatures significant authority to rebalance the constitutional structure for the purpose of restoring our founding principles, should the federal government shed its limitations, abandon its original purpose, and grow too powerful. As many delegates in Philadelphia in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention feared, which is exactly why they provided for two methods of amending the Constitution. On June 11, 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, George Mason of Virginia, one of the most underrated of the Founding Fathers and one of the greatest men in American history, who had drafted Virginia's Declaration of Rights, the precursor to the Declaration of Independence, he responded to some of the delegates who didn't see the necessity of having the states propose amendments, which he strongly advocated for. In Madison's notes at the Constitutional Convention, he writes about Mason's comments, Colonel Mason urged the necessity of such a provision. The plan now to be formed will certainly be defective, this is what Mason said, as the Confederation has been found on trial to be, meaning the Articles of Confederation. Amendments, therefore, will be necessary, and it will be better to provide for them in an easy, regular, and constitutional way than to trust to chance and violence. It would be improper, Mason said, to require the consent of the national legislature because they may abuse their power and refuse to their consent on that very account. And so there was some debate. And then 2 days before the end of the Constitutional Convention on September 17th, that was the last day, 2 days before, on September 15th, Mason was back at it. Mason, alarmed that Congress would have the sole power to propose amendments, continued to insist on state authority to call for conventions. George Mason explained that an oppressive Congress would never agree to propose amendments curtailing its own tyranny. Back to Madison's notes, citing Mason. Colonel Mason thought the plan of amending the Constitution exceptional and dangerous, as the proposing of amendments is in both the modes to depend and in the first immediately, in the second ultimately on Congress. No amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive, as he verily believed would be the case. Quote, unquote, Madison's notes, September 15, 1787. Mr. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, Mr. Eldridge Gerry of Massachusetts moved to amend the article so as to require a convention on application of 2/3 of the states. And there you have it. Now, under both amendment procedures, the Constitution requires that 3/4 of the states ratify the amendments, either by their state legislatures or state conventions. So again, rather than Congress proposing amendments, what's suggested here is that the states can and should convene to do the same thing. Now, I was originally very skeptical of amending the Constitution by the state convention process. I, like many of you, was concerned it could turn into a runaway caucus. And as an ardent defender of the Constitution who reveres the brilliance of the framers, I assumed this would play disastrously into the hands of the statists. But today, I am a confident and enthusiastic advocate for the process. The text of Article 5 makes abundantly clear that there is a serious check in place. Whether the product of Congress or the state convention, a proposed amendment has no effect at all unless, quote, ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by the conventions in 3/4 thereof. This, ladies and gentlemen, should extinguish anxiety that the state convention process could hijack the Constitution. It is impossible. And after more research and reflection, the issue crystallized further for me. If the framers were alarmed that states calling for, quote, a convention for proposing amendments, unquote, could undo the entire undertaking of the Constitutional Convention, then why did they craft, adopt, and endorse the language? And it was strongly endorsed in the Federalist Papers by Madison and Hamilton. And I'm not going to read it to you, but it's in the book Federalist 43 as a perfect example. Madison writing, or Federalist 85, Hamilton writing. And here's the beauty of the process. Congress's role in the state application process is minimal and ministerial. And it couldn't be otherwise, because the framers and ratifiers adopted the state convention process for the purpose of establishing an alternative to the congressionally initiated amendment process. That was the point. Now you can see why the ruling class and their little mouthpieces in the blogger sphere and columnists and so forth, are going to hate yours truly. Because this removes power from them. It gives it to the state delegates and state senators, who you will have an effect on one day. I want to make some final comments about this after this next break, and then we'll move along. But this is what my new book is about, The Liberty Amendments, Restoring the American Republic. This process, plus 11 proposed amendments. Not abstractions, not novelties, but amendments that are in keeping with the framers' intent with respect to limitations on the federal government and the nurturing of individual and state sovereignty.
Mark Levin.
We'll get to the other stuff, I promise. I promise. I just want to wrap this up. The book is The Liberty Amendments. You can pre-order it now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It'll be everywhere when it comes out in August. Restoring the American Republic. I really hope you'll get it. I really want you to digest it. I'm not going to talk about the amendments that I propose should there one day be a state convention process, which I hope so. It's a preferable alternative to what's coming, in my view. But I have no illusions about the political difficulty in rallying support for amending the Constitution by this process. All past efforts have fallen short. And the governing masterminds and their disciples are more powerful and strident than ever. There is no doubt that their resistance will be stubborn and their tactics desperate as they unleash the instrumentalities of the federal government and the outlets of a lapdog media to vanquish such a movement and subdue the public. But having rejected the Constitution's limits, they won't be persuaded by references to the Constitution's text and history. Their evasions have been their design. Others who self-identify as originalists and constitutionalists and conservatives, if you will, in asserting allegiance to the Constitution, as I do, might nonetheless be wary of or opposed reflexively to the state convention process for several reasons, including their unfamiliarity with its history and workings. But perhaps in time, their high regard for the Constitution will persuade them of the judiciousness in resorting to the Constitution before there's little left of it. Still, more may be resigned to a grim future, preferring lamentation to the hard work of purposeful action. And of course, there are always the unmindful and content among us. Whatever the reasons, there are also untold numbers of citizens like you who comprehend the perilousness of the times and circumstances and the urgency of drawing the nation's attention to restoration of constitutional republicanism. This book is an appeal to you. Not the ruling class, not the chattering class, not the statists and the neo-statists. This book is for you, and it is an appeal to you. Our magnificent framers anticipated that this day might arrive because they knew that republics deteriorate at first from within. They provided you with a lawful and civil way to repair what has transpired. We, the people, through our state legislatures and the state legislatures acting collectively, have enormous power to constrain the federal government, reestablish self-government, and secure individual sovereignty. In my book, the proposed amendments to the Constitution, what I call the Liberty Amendments, is intended to underscore what the framers gave us. It is my hope, it is my aspiration for this country, that these amendments can spur interest in and ultimately support for the state convention process. In any event, should there come a time, sooner or later, when the states convene a convention, these amendments, or amendments of the same nature, because I don't make any claim of unassailable knowledge, may prove useful and find their way into the debate. But ladies and gentlemen, a plan is what is needed, as is a first step. And this is mine. So yes, we will continue to talk about what's going on in this country. We will continue to support candidates who we think are conservative constitutionalists who believe in limited government and individual liberty. We will continue to be active and do what we can when it comes to the federal government and its various branches. But let us not fool ourselves anymore. The federal government is not going to reform itself. The federal Republican politicians are not going to reform themselves. They're part of the problem. The consultant class, the Washington operatives, the media, they're all in this together. Now, they're a top-down operation. They use the instrumentalities of the federal government to do what they're doing. We're a bottom-up operation. We believe in the grassroots. We believe in the people. We believe in the Tea Party. We believe in state representatives and state senators, leaning on them, electing them, making sure they do what we want them to do. And in the months ahead, this is what I hope to discuss with you. I'll be right back.